Okay, thanks for joining our conversation with Richard Vedder, who is a professor emeritus of economics at Ohio University, a proud member of the MAC, and in Athens, Ohio. Professor Vedder is also a senior fellow at the Independent Institute, among many other affiliations. I am familiar with his work, as may you be as well, on higher education in particular, and the economics of it. And we might talk about that a little bit in light of a recent piece Professor Vedder had in the Wall Street Journal on the taxation of higher ed endowments. But let's begin, Professor Vedder, just by asking when you started teaching economics.
Well, I started teaching economics back in the dark ages. I tell people I can't remember whether it was in the Old Testament of the Bible or the New Testament of the Bible where I first appeared. That's a bit of an exaggeration, but I started full-time teaching as a professor in 1965, which is to say this is the 59th year that I've been involved in higher ed. In fact, that's an understatement, because as a graduate student before that, I was teaching the day John F. Kennedy was assassinated in 1963. So I've been around the block, as it were, for 6 decades, so I have a pretty good historical perspective on this.
How has the academic study of economics changed since then, if at all? And I know
the study has changed. In my field, it's gotten more, for decades, the big thing was become more technical, to be more pseudo-scientific, I guess you would say. Some economists talk about physics and envy. They all wanted to act like they were physicists, because the physicists were considered the most brainy, scientific, pure scientist types among in the academic community. And that happened, and that still is the trend. In doing there's trade-offs in everything in life we in economics teach. And one of the trade-offs is that economists have become more distant from the public on average. That is to say, their own writing and their own works are less comprehensible to the average, moderately well-educated human being. So in the last generation or so, after having done a lot of the standard technical stuff, particularly in the last generation, I started doing work with a broader implication. I tell my young colleagues, I said I had a piece in the Wall Street Journal, and they say, well, I had a piece in the American Economic Review. And I said, well, the circulation of the Wall Street Journal is 150 times larger than that of the American Economic Review, even if it has less prestige among ordinary people, or among economists. So that's my background.
Yeah. Now, I worked at the Bradley Foundation, which would have been known with others, including Olin, for helping fund the law and economics movement.
I was the John M. Olin Professor of Labor Economics once at Washington U in St. Louis, so I have a fond affiliation, I guess, in a way, with Olin as well.
Yeah. How has a knowledge or understanding of economics in public policy making, I suppose, as opposed to law, changed, if at all, in the past, 30 to 50 years?
Well, I think economists like to think by becoming more scientific and more rigorous in statistical methods, econometrics, as we say, things like that, that they have a greater sense of authority today and so forth. I'm not sure that's true. If you actually, one thing that the public looks at is how good can economists predict things.
Mm.
A year ago, a little over a year ago, so almost though the beginning of the last year, the consensus among economists who spoke on the matter was that the United States was getting ready to go into a fairly significant depression. We had, after all, interest rates were going up. That should lead to declining economic activity. This should lead to a pause in the economy, indeed a decline in output. What in reality happened in 2023 is we had more economic growth than we have had in a number of years, as conventionally measured, that is. Well, the stock market was up 20%. Most people would have predicted it would have been down. And so our ability to forecast the future, to use that as one measure of, let's call it professional competence, has not shown any significant improvement. And indeed, I would argue maybe we've worsened a little because we've gotten a little cockier and a little more self-assured. We know how to solve all the problems of the world, whereas a generation or two ago, many of my colleagues were a little more measured in their assertions that they made.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. How about narrowing the denominator here, as it were? That's about as much as I know about economics. But to policy regarding charitable giving, is there enough of an understanding of economics among those who make and or implement what I'm going to call tax incentivized charitable giving?
Well, I'm not even sure where to start here. First of all, most economists work for organizations that are heavily dependent on charities. If you include as charities government support, which is not really what you're thinking about, you're thinking of private support, but most universities are at least partly dependent on charitable support, and some of them mightily so, the Ivies and so on, as you know. And so charitable contributions are vital to the academic space, and most economists, I think, they're aware of that. And in fact, grantsmanship is a big part of the game for young aspiring scholars, and has been for decades, by the way. That is fairly unchanged. So we have everyone is thinking about, boy, charitable money is important, is necessary. If you're going to be a success in academics, you got to get grants. And in the sciences, the natural sciences, they actually measure success in part by the amount of grants you receive, which always bothered me a bit, because they're measuring people's success by the, if you like, the inputs, the money coming in rather than the outputs, the research going out. The two are related to one another, but they aren't perfectly related. So yeah, money is the name of the game. The irony of it is higher ed has undergone quite a change in the last decade or so, and enrollments have fallen. Financial support has been a little weakened in some areas by governments in terms of governmental support. We had the pandemic, which was a disruptor, which, no one can blame higher ed for that. Although I know some people who would blame higher ed partly for that, but that's a story for another day. So I think higher ed has been disrupted in a way lately that has really changed things a bit. And university governance has been shaken to the core. Obviously, in the last month or so, we've seen this, but even before then, it was starting to happen. University presidents 50 years ago, 40 years ago, 25 years ago, served 7, 8 years, typically at a university, then sometimes moved on to another university. maybe spent 20 years of their lives as a president from the age of 45 or 50 to the age of 65 or 70 at 2 or 3 different schools. Nowadays, a president who goes more than 5 years at an institution is has viewed as having a long career at that place. It's a sketchy, difficult job to be a university president these days.
How would a university act differently if it were subject to market pressures? Before we get to taxation, which is a different kind of pressure, but
Well, that's the ultimate question. I mean, that's the appropriate question. I'm sort of writing a book right now on, I call it creative destruction in higher ed, because there was a great economist named Joseph Schumpeter who died decades, 1950, he died. But Schumpeter said that the essence of capitalism is creative destruction. The way businesses succeed is ironically partly by failing. We have businesses that fail because the markets don't let them succeed because they're making mistakes. And the consequences of mistake is failure. It's bankruptcy. It's dying, literally. And so we have new businesses come on that are in effect get their resources partially from those old businesses that failed. In higher ed, when was the last time you heard of a major university fail? When was if you ask people in 1950, who are the 10 best universities in America? You get the same list then as you get today, more or less. Harvard was number one in 1650, 1750, 1850, 1950, and 2020. I'm not so sure in 2023 that's or 4 that's quite so certain, but they've been at the top, and all the other schools. Occasionally a new one will come along. So we don't have creative destruction in higher ed, which means that people get complacent. They don't have the incentives at a high level of incentives that force them to do things that they might do if it were a different environment. And philanthropy, by the way, which is necessary and useful and important to higher ed, serves a very important function. But it does also have the possibility of prolonging organizations that maybe should fail. And sometimes we allow schools to limp along for a number of years. It might have been better if they really had failed and new ones come along. So there's that issue.